Marina Pereira de Almeida e Souza, doutoranda em Língua Comparada pela Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, mestre em Literatura Inglesa pela Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais e atualmente é professora de inglês e pesquisadora da literatura afro-americana e afro-brasileira, estudando a representação física e psicológica do trauma, seus efeitos nos indivíduos e na comunidade, a fim de permitir a criação de uma identidade afrodescendente por meio da memória. Hoje a professora Marina vai apresentar para nós a palestra titulada Trauma e Memória Coletiva em Amada, de Toni Morrison, e defeitos de cor, da escritora brasileira Ana Maria Gonçalves. Então, professora Marina, seja muito bem-vinda ao PTC, seja muito bem-vinda à licenciatura em Línguas Modernas, com ênfase em inglês, da UPTC. Também muito obrigada pela assistência a todos aqueles que estão conosco hoje. A palavra é sua.
Ok. Vou falar só um pouquinho em português para agradecer. Queria agradecer a Aida pelo convite e também ao programa de licenciaturas de Línguas Modernas com ênfase em inglês, da Escola de Idioma da Universidade Pedagógica e Tecnológica da Colômbia, e também o grupo de pesquisa Si Mañana Despierto, por estar proporcionando, né, essa apresentação para a gente e também este debate. Can I change to English? Yes? Okay. So, I will just present my slides here. And if I look to my left, it's because the slides are on my left in another screen, okay? So, good afternoon, and first I would like to thank everybody for being here, and I am so glad that I have the opportunity to participate in this conference. We know how important it is, as Professor Aida said, to make these events happen so we can debate over such relevant topics, right? So first I would like to present the historical context to you so we can set the works in place and time, right? So I'd like to start with a historical background related to Brazil, right, and the United States in terms of colonization and slavery, right? And for us to do this, we need to go back to 1492, when Christopher Columbus discovered the New World, right, under the orders of Catholic kings in Spain. And this triggered the longest and fiercest international dispute over colonial possessions between the 16th and the 19th centuries. And his travels paved the way for a period of contact, expansion, exploration, conquest, and colonization of the American continent by Europeans. Among the various changes caused by such expeditions, the slave trade was one of the greatest impact for capitalism in the world, as it allowed to elevate the mercantile system to a degree of splendor, glory, that would never have done otherwise. And in fact, the importance of the discovery of the American continent was not in the metals found here, but actually in the inexhaustible market that it offered to European products. European colonies were supplied with slave and typically black labor coming from West Africa through the maritime trade route. The choice was not moral, but only economic, since with the reduced population of Europe in the 16th century, there would be no way to provide the necessary number of free workers for large-scale production of sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton in the New World, right? So thus the arrival of the Portuguese in the African continent caused trafficking slavery to become the largest forced migration of people in history. Although they did not demonstrate any interest in colonizing African territories, the Portuguese were keen to their exclusivity and therefore established an advanced exchange system. Initially, they exchanged spices. Later, they would exchange firearms for slaves. And the choice for slaves was due to the small demand for work in the largest cities in the world, like in the Iberian Peninsula, for example, such as Lisbon in Portugal and Seville in Spain. And the first ship registered left the sub-Saharan Africa towards Portugal around 1440. And at that time, the Portuguese colonies of Azores, Madeira, and Cabo Verde had sugarcane production that supplied not only Lisbon, but also England, ports in Flanders, and some cities in Italy. And then in 1948, the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama discovered a sea route to India that would allow the Portuguese to carry out the spice trade without the intermediation of Arabs and Venetians, who had a monopoly on the trade in the Mediterranean Sea. And as an immediate consequence, there was a drop in spices prices. With the decline of commerce, Portuguese attention turned to Portuguese America, and the constant invasion attempts became a concern. Furthermore, the discovery of gold in Spanish America aroused Portugal's great interest in its newly discovered lands in Brazil, also attracting the attention of Holland, of France, and England, who questioned the Treaty of Tordesilhas, of which they did not take part at this moment. And in this way, in order not to lose their lands, Portugal would have to occupy them, which required a lot of resources. Without finding gold, however, some economic activity would have to be developed to offset the costs of this occupation. Agricultural production proved unviable. Therefore, it is in this context that in 1534, the king Dom João III, or Dom John III, started the system of hereditary captaincies with the intention of beginning the settlement process in the colony in the least expensive way possible for Portugal. After around 50 years or so, using the island of Madeira, São Tomé and Príncipe, Azores, and Cabo Verde as a laboratory for sugarcane plantations with the hereditary captaincy system, the Portuguese acquired extensive experience in field, and the country already dominated the sugar mill equipment industry, so they had a lot of experience. And the offer of the product, which was still relatively new in Europe, in Italian cities, created consumers, which did not prevent the onset of a price drop crisis in 1496, redirecting a large part of production to Flemish ports. This association between Portugal and Spain was vital to absorb the large Brazilian production that entered the market from the second half of the 16th century. It is also important to highlight that by this time, the Portuguese already had complete knowledge of the functioning of the African slave market, having begun war operations to capture pagan blacks a century earlier, right, in the times of Dom Henrique. And together with this system, right, of hereditary captaincies and their guarantees, the sugarcane planting begins in Brazil, right? And the Portuguese hoped that by introducing sugarcane cultivation, they would be able to establish colonization and guarantee the Portuguese presence in order to prevent external invasions and foreign threats, right? And the Portuguese chose sugarcane due to their previous experience with cultivation, as I mentioned before, the hot, right, and the humid climate for almost the entire year here in Brazil, the favorable soil, of course, and high profitability, as sugar was considered a fine spice in Europe. The first form of work on sugarcane plantations was characterized by the use of enslaved indigenous people, right? The problem is the system failed to develop. Why? Because indigenous people resisted enslavement and Portuguese colonization. Additionally, the arrival of Europeans in Brazilian territory brought several diseases such as typhoid fever, measles, influenza, and the bubonic plague. The indigenous people, completely susceptible to European diseases, became sick or died. Therefore, the exploitation of this type of work was not profitable for the state. Furthermore, the Jesuit priests who worked to catechize this population were also against indigenous slavery, since one of the justifications for the forced labor of an individual was precisely paganism, right? And it is for this reason that gradually indigenous labor was replaced by American labor, because the trade of African slaves would generate high revenue for the Portuguese government. So between 1560 and 1570, Brazil became the largest sugar producer in the world, which led the Portuguese to import Africans en masse into the country in order to meet the demand for work, right? And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the same process, right, or the similarities between this Brazil process of slavery, and also now I'm going to talk about the United States process, right? Similarly, slavery in the United States began when Europeans who had arrived there perceived Africans as a cheaper and more productive labor. Initially, England and France followed the Spanish practice of enslaving indigenous people. But little by little, the natives were largely exterminated by war, by overwork, and disease brought by white men, as it happened here in Brazil. And submitting the Indians to the mines, to their to the European, right, monotonous, unhealthy, and heavy work without this tribal sense, without religious rituals that they had, was like taking away the meaning of life, right? So this meant to enslave not only the flesh of these Indians, but also their collective spirit, right? So indigenous slavery was never extensive in the British dominions, right? Through the experience of the Portuguese and Spanish, the British also realized that indigenous slavery, in addition to not being profitable enough, was inefficient and limited, right? So for them, one Black person was worth 4 Indians, as they considered them to be more robust for working on future export products, such as sugar and cotton. So in this way, Black people were stolen from Africa to work on stolen land from Indians in America, right? In any case, indigenous slavery never interfered with the slave trade and Black slavery, as it never received any attention from the central government. And it is important to point out at this moment that the Indians' immediate successor in the United States was not the Black man, but it was the poor white man, right? These workers were called engaged, and they signed a term of engagement recognized by law, by which they were obliged to provide services for a specific period of time to cover the price of the ticket. Others were payers who agreed with the ship's captain that they would pay the ticket upon arrival or within a specified period of time following arrival. And others were convicted criminals sent by deliberate policy of the English government to work for a stipulated period of time. However, the working conditions of those engaged worsened in the agriculture colonies for sport. And what was once supposed to be a provision of services based on relationships, free from voluntary contracts for a fixed period, became a property relationship that ended exerting extensive control over people's bodies and rights during the term of the contract, right? And we know, right, by studying this period, that engagement became an institution that in some aspects was very close to slavery, that these engaged workers, they were almost like a piece of furniture, right? And the fear of the metropolitan overpopulation in the early 17th century gave way to fear of underpopulation in the middle of the same century. So the system of deporting criminals now went against the English national interest in developing industry in the country, which needed workers. Right? So mercantilists at the time said that it was preferable to pay low wages, but keep the population within English limits. Right? Furthermore, the demand for farms in the United States was exceeding the number of convictions in England, failing, of course, to supply the agriculture sector in the colonies with labor, right? The institution of a fixed term service contract for those engaged presented serious drawbacks, as by releasing themselves from the contract, the whites became small besiegers in the countryside, creating a democratic force that could aspire to the independence of the metropolis. So planters then began to look at Black Africans as perpetual servants and therefore as more useful assets, since they were infinitely cheaper and had more labor power, right? And in fact, Black slavery occurred as a naturalized path, since the work system along these lines was already established by disengaged workers, right? So soon, the first Africans were taken to the North American colony of Jamestown in the state of Virginia in 1619 to work on cotton and tobacco plantations. Subsequently, the slave regime spread throughout the American colonies. Although it is impossible to gauge precise numbers, it is estimated that 6 to 7 million slaves were imported to the New World in the 18th century alone, right? So depriving the African continent of its best and healthiest men and women, right? There is an author called Hugh Thomas, and he has a volume of books that talks about the slave trade. And according to him, right, the slavery in the United States was practiced throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, causing African and African American slaves to help build the economic foundation of the new nation, right? So as in Brazil, most slaves imported to the United States lived in large farms and plantations, right? Many of their masters made them completely dependent on a system of restrictive codes that governed these Africans' lives. They were prohibited from learning to read and write, and of course that their movement was restricted, right? Many masters also had sexual...
Teacher, excuse me,
Yeah.
excuse me one
Sure.
second. Are you switching the slides? Because we can only see one that says the title.
No, I know,
okay.
I know.
Okay, thank you.
It's all okay.
Okay,
I will
thank you
change
so
in a
much.
minute.
Okay, thank
No
you so
problem.
much. Excuse me for
Yeah.
jumping in.
No problem, it's okay. So actually the slaves, they were prohibited from learning to read and write, and their movement was restricted. And also many masters, right, they had sexual freedom with enslaved Black women and rewarded obedience through favors, with rebellious slaves being brutally punished, right? So a strict hierarchy among them meant that they remained separate and divided in order to avoid and prevent rebellions. Also, marriages between enslaved people had no legal basis, right? As much as many lords encouraged this practice, none of them hesitated when it was necessary to separate families in case of sales or removal. So these power relations in both the United States and Brazil corrupted the whites who had authority over slaves, and masters normally used physical punishment to impose their will. So enslaved people were punished with whipping, with hanging, burning, mutilation, rape, imprisonment, and other things. Most punishments were due to disobedience or repeated infractions. However, abuses occurred in order to ensure the master's dominance over the slaves. Right? The atrocities suffered by a large number of people for such a long time were so absurd that artistic expressions with the theme of trauma as a legacy of slavery became unavoidable. And critics and readers generally agree that Beloved by African-American writer Toni Morrison and Defeito de Cor by Brazilian Ana Maria Gonçalves are accounts of this type of trauma, since the lives of Seth and Kendé, both protagonists of the novels, are imbued with physical and mental suffering. They suffer from the bodily and physical wounds inflicted by white supremacy, the devastating effects of slave, racism, and sexism. Due to the fact that such experiences were poorly assimilated, the characters in those novels are unable to put them into words, and for this very reason, finding a path to healing becomes even more difficult. So the struggle of the characters is remarkable when they try to move on with their lives, but simply cannot due to the symptoms of trauma that haunt them day and night, leaving them close to the limit of madness and mental disturbance, right? So now I will start changing the slides here. And as Professor Aida mentioned, in my doctorate research, I have been working with Beloved and Defeito de Cor, and I'd like to read to you this quote by Ouellet. He's a French professor at the University of Sorbonne, and he says that literature does not rewrite history. It invents time that history has not retained, and an amnesic time rather than a memorial time, a time of oblivion that only words can trace back to the source. Poetic or romantic writing raises indeed, in its most salient reliefs, its most pregnant excrescences, from which falls or has fallen into the deepest oblivion, into the hollows of history, the crevices of memory, its flaws, its interstices, which only fiction can penetrate, then explore. I will explain this citation in a minute, but basically what these two authors were trying to do is that they were trying to fill the gaps, right, that history, the official history and the hegemonic history could not do it, right? So first I would like to present to you these two novels so we can give a little bit of context to you in case you haven't read them. So Beloved, I will start with Beloved. Beloved examines the destructive legacy of slavery as it chronicles the life of a Black woman named Seth, from her pre-Civil War days as a slave in Kentucky to her time in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1873. Although Seth lives there as a free woman, she is held prisoner by memories of the trauma of her life as a slave. And in the novel, Seth is a passionately devoted mother who flees with her children from an abusive master known as a school teacher. They are caught, and in an act of supreme love and sacrifice, she tries to kill her children to keep them away from slavery. Only her 2-year-old daughter named Beloved dies, and the school teacher, believing Seth is crazy, decides not to take her back. These events are revealed in flashbacks as the novel opens in 1873 with Seth and her teenage daughter Denver living in Ohio, where their house is haunted by the angry ghost of the child Seth killed. The hauntings are alleviated by the arrival of a man called Paul D. He is so ravaged by his slave past that he keeps his feelings in the tobacco bin of his heart. Of course, that this is a metaphor, right? He worked on the same plantation as Seth, and the two begin a relationship. A brief period of relative calm ends with the appearance of a young woman who says that her name is Beloved. She knows things that suggest she is the reincarnation of Seth's lost daughter. And Seth is obsessed with assuaging her guilt and tries to placate the increasingly demanded, manipulative Beloved. And the situation at this house worsens as Seth loses her job and becomes completely fixated on Beloved. While the lonely and largely housebound Denver initially befriends Beloved, she begins to grow concerned later. She finally dares to venture outside in order to ask the community for help, and she is given food and a job. As the local women attempt to stage an exorcism, Denver's employer arrives to take her to work, and Seth mistakes him for a school teacher and tries to attack him with an ice pick. And at this moment, the other women restrain her, and during the commotion, Beloved dissipates, she disappears. Odie later returns to the grieving Seth, promising to care for her, and Denver continues to thrive in the outside world. And now I'm going to talk about a little bit um defeito de cor, right? In this work, Ana Maria Gonçalves manages to capture the Afro-descendant discourse in Brazil and the marks left by the experience of slavery. The work tells us the story of Candé, who, like Seth, the protagonist of Beloved, left Africa still a child and embarked on a slave ship to work in the Americas. Candé is subjected to all kinds of violence, both in Africa and in Brazil. And in her narrator's voice, she tells details of her capture, talks about her life as a slave in the island of Itaparica in Bahia. She talks about her lovers, her disappointments and sufferings, and the trips around Brazil in search for one of her children. When captured and put on a ship headed to Brazil, Candé remembers once more the death of her mother and her blood, and also her brother's blood, both murdered on the same occasion. Unfortunately, the upcoming experiences would not help Candé in terms of assimilating the first trauma. Despite having already been baptized as Luisa before leaving to Brazil and having the imposition of Catholic religion, Christian religion, it was always as Candé that she introduced herself to the sacred and the secret. And the narrator somehow tries to cling to her African religious traditions with the purpose of enduring the hard mishaps that life presented. So Candé, like Seth, suffers from the symptoms of previous traumas and does not manage to get rid of them. Her traumatic past and that of other slaves are trapped inside her as she cannot escape the inevitability of her memories and the memories from others. And furthermore, the trauma experiences are then presented abruptly, and Candé, like the other protagonists, Seth cannot grieve for her losses. In countless other passages, Candé resorts to African myths and their creative aspects, to rituals related to the supernatural, as well as to typical ceremonies, right? So Ana Maria Gonçalves recovers through the protagonist elements of the narrative structure and the thematic configuration of slave narratives, right? So initially, my project was to trace a parallel between the main characters of the two novels and to study how to internalize the traumatic experiences from the past and how they managed to heal themselves. I also wanted to understand how the community of women plays an important role in the healing processes. And also another objective was to understand how the cultural trauma of slavery is determinant in the formation of an African American and African-Brazilian identity, right? So while researching, I read this text that I put here at first, Writing Against Memory and Forgetting. This is a Gabrielle Schwab's text in which she explores the matter of trauma in literary texts. After reading it, I could still do research on all these topics, but with a different perspective, right? So I added this, which is the theory of cryptonomy, to the analysis. This was created by Nicholas Abraham and Maria Torok, in which they make a distinction between the process of introjection and incorporation of a traumatic experience. So according to them, they are psychoanalysts. Under normal circumstances, an individual mourns a loss by introjecting the lost person or object, which facilitates the integration into the psyche. However, when an individual refuses to mourn, he or she incorporates the lost object or person by refusing any association with the loss and denying knowledge of it. So I will just read here very quickly so you can understand that we have three typical tomes, right? We have an individual tome. It can be read as a theory of readability of trauma's secret spaces. The crypt becomes visible, traceable, or readable, not only in cryptic or hieroglyphic verbs, but in other gaps or deformations of language, such as incoherences, discontinuities, disruptions, and the disintegration of meaning or grammar or semantic and rhetorical coherence. And the memory is consisted of buried alive words. We also have a familial tome, right? The tome can be a familial one, and it is organized around family secrets shared by parents and grandparents, but fearfully guarded from children. It is through the unconscious transmission of these avowed familial dynamics that one generation affects other generations' unconscious. And we have the collective tome. This is called by Abraham and Maria Torok artificial unconscious, right? The supra-individual memory, transgenerational haunting. It is not so much the content of the secret or the story that is revealed, but rather the imprint it has left, perhaps over generations, on a fact and its expression in speech and writing, right? So in these two works, right, in Beloved and in Um Defeito de Cor, we can find all of these tomes, right, which I will explain more a little bit. In the analysis of these two works, I privileged the process of incorporation, right, because I realized that the protagonists make use of this defensive mechanism based on a denial of loss, right? Sith and Kende, they identify and merge with their losses. That is the reason why they create a crypt within in order to bury the lost person. It can be a lost object, it can be a lost idea, or even a part of their history, whereas keeping them psychically alive. So the consequences of such a burial are discussed throughout the thesis, but according to the theory of cryptonomy, the undead losses become ghosts that come back to haunt the victim, taking the form of symptoms such as nightmares, hallucinations, flashbacks, and compulsive behavioral repetitions, right, as indicated here in the slide. As I could observe in these two novels, trauma disrupts the character's sense of temporality, referentiality, and rationality. They cannot locate themselves in time, since the presentness of the traumatic experience causes them to be imprisoned at the time when the horrific event happened. Since this process of incorporation presumes an indirect reception of the phenomenon, Sith and Kende don't have direct access to the experience, and therefore their perception of it is always evasive and ambiguous. And the protagonists lose the capacity for linking because trauma represents an attack on thought. since they cannot cope with the psychic pain, they experience somatic enactments, right? And in order to contribute to this analysis of this session, I resorted to the work of Kathy Carruth, actually two works of Kathy Carruth. One is Trauma, Explorations in Memory, and the other one is Unclaimed Experience, Trauma, Narrative, and History, right? Her analysis linking trauma, history, and culture really helped me throughout the process of this research, right? I'm going to talk about here these consequences of embracing death in life, right? So the first consequence we see is that the characters' discourses are affected by trauma. Since violent histories are hibernating in the protagonist's unconscious, they provoke a lack of signification in language. So trauma carves in language traces of refused mourning. And in order to consolidate this argument, I drawed on Freud's Beyond the Pleasure principle, because there he points out the interplay between unconscious and conscious forces within individuals' psyches. But also I resorted to Lacan's the mirror stage as formative of the function of the I, as reviewed in psychoanalytic experience, because he links the idea of memory to discourse. And Lacan demonstrates that trauma is what escapes the symbolic stage because it does not belong to language and it is lost in the imaginary. And according to Jacques Derrida, in the elaboration of force, what is force? Force is the preface of the work of Abraham and Maria Torok that talks about the theory of cryptonomy. So in this preface, Jacques Derrida says that trauma causes linguistic scars. So characters' discourses show traces of the process of incorporation because they are full of secrets, silences, distortions of the signifying process. So I will show now with extracts of the novels how trauma is relegated to the protagonist's unconscious, causing their speeches to be ciphered, only perceptible in a symptomatic reading, right? So I will take a look here. Yes, I have already talked about this. I want this slide. So these are examples of incorporation process in Beloved, right? I will read some of them really quickly here because our time is running fast. So take a look at the second balloon. They say here, maybe I should leave things the way they are, she said. How are they? We get along. What about inside? I don't go inside, right? So the balloon in the center. Not a house in the country ain't packed to its rafters with some dead Negro's grief, right? The balloon on your top right. I was talking about time. It's so hard for me to believe in it. Some things go, pass on, some things just stay. I used to think it was my remembering. You know, some things you forget, other things you never do. Then the left balloon on your right. Places are still there. If a house burns down, it's gone, but the place, the picture of it stays, and not just in my remembering, but out there in the world, right? And here I brought some examples of the same process, but in defeito de cor, right? So let's take a look at the second balloon on our left. Sitting on the sand, I watched the sea and wept for all those deaths that seemed to be inside of me, taking up so much space that they didn't let me feel nothing more, right? The top balloon on your right, I hadn't cried for them. I only stopped when late at night as Maria came back from the village and missed me, right? And the other balloon on your right, despite my young age, I think it was at that moment that I became aware that I had to do something for my dad, for all the dads that were there, for all of us who were alive as if we weren't, because our lives were worth what the master had paid for them, nothing more, right? So the story of these women also mirror the stories of millions of people affected by the atrocities of slavery, right? So the works addresses what Nicholas and Maria Torok called transgenerational trauma, since individual and communal crypts are presented in the novels. Because traumatic memory is constituted of buried alive words, its silences can be transmitted to the next generation in the form of ghosts of the past, right? And in the thesis, I argue that neo-slave narratives like these are important because they are representations of the past in language, and therefore they contribute to a heterogeneous and holistic view of history. Although they present the perspective of the defeated, the silenced, and the forgotten, they promote a destabilization in the hegemonic natural discourse, allowing the recovering of once marginalized voices, right? And my concerns then, right, were directed to how unspeakable memories can be traceable in language. So it is really relevant to have an analysis of the intersections of displacement, trauma, and motherhood, because these issues are very salient in the novels, right? And in order to better understand the role of the community of women, it is of great significance to link the protagonists and the community's mothering experiences, because it is this connection that saves Sith and Kendeh from isolation, allowing them to restore their bonds with the community and finally give a proper burial to the ghosts of the past. And also, it is important to point out how the healing processes of the protagonists and their communities are inevitably intertwined. While in their journeys towards healing, the protagonists encounter people that help them initiate the process of breaking and accessing the crypt. And by doing this, these two protagonists allow their memories to come up, bringing reconciliation with their past traumas and also with all the African Americans and all the African Brazilians' horrific past, right? So I have already talked the process of healing, redemption, and community. I forgot to pass on the slides, but I am going to my conclusion right now. So the protagonists' ways of internalizing traumatic experience are similar. They both create inside them a crypt in which they place their losses. For both characters, incorporate them within. And consequently, they are unable to mourn and put horrific moments into words. Because they are undead, these traumatic memories return as ghosts to haunt Sith and Kendeh in the forms of dreams, of hallucinations, flashback, and repetitions. And because of their inability of introjecting, the protagonists generate other sources of trauma, creating an endless circle of violence and perpetuation. And these obscure processes create silences and gaps in languages, for the characters cannot have access to their inner crypts. So therefore, they speak a ciphered language that can only be understood if it's read in a symptomatic manner, right? So listening to these silences is to decipher their discourses. And I conclude by saying that in these two novels, healing is only possible when characters are able to narrate their stories. The protagonists' traumas are remedied by the end of both novels, after they can translate their traumatic memories into words and reconcile with the community. As I said before, I would like to conclude this presentation by saying that in these works, individual healing is deeply attached to communal atonement. So the crypt is only broken when the characters are able to narrate their stories and open up themselves to the community. So Remembering those who are gone, telling their stories and bringing them forward is to honor their history. And um defeito de cor and beloved break through the silence of trauma, right? And this trauma attacks on language, so as to integrate conflicted stories into a communal and political space, right? So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Marina.
Yeah,
It's so
thank you.
interesting for us to listen to you. I have a question. Professor Marina, what's important for us as a teacher to read these kind of novels and to study about these topics?
Can you repeat the question, please? Because the connection failed a little bit.
I, what is important for us as a teachers of studying these topics, to read of reading these novels, to understand the context and the literature?
Okay, yeah. Well, I believe it is really important for us as not just as literature students, right, that are at the university, but I think that this kind of knowledge should be more democratized, especially here in Latin America. It is important for us because we are not in a post-racism period, right? We are not there. So these problems are still happening, and people sometimes they fail to understand why. Sometimes they fail to understand, to identify that, and we need to understand why things happen today, right? And it is important for us to read these novels because in terms of post-colonialism and in terms of decoloniality, right, we have also knowledge and epistemology that it is being produced here in Latin America that is so relevant as the European epistemology, right? So it is important for us to understand why these artistic expressions, right, happened when they happened and why they happened, right? So when we take a look at these contexts, we can understand better how we are as a society and why we are right now in terms of society, in terms of nation, in terms of people, right? And I chose to work with these two novels, right? Because the United States and Brazil, they had similarities in the process of slavery, right? And it's not a coincidence or an accident that we had an African-American writer that wrote about this in a perspective of a woman, right? And it's not a coincidence that we have an African-Brazilian writer here in Brazil that talks about the same experience, right? Because we had the same problem, which was slavery for centuries. So for me, it is really important to understand why has this book appeared? Why has this work appeared, right? So these are questions that we should ask frequently, right? So we can understand better us as society, right? So I think that this debate should also leave the university and goes to the other layers of society, so people can understand themselves better. We should understand ourselves better as a society.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
Let's
you.
open talk in English.
Think in English.
Anyone wants to ask anything for the Professor Marina?
Yeah.
¿Alguien gustaría de preguntar alguna cosa para la profesora Marina?
I would like to a quick question.
Yeah.
So, Professor, what do you think, like, as following the question of Professor Aida, like the importance of, for us as language teachers to introduce historical context to our classes regarding, for example, as you said, that slavery didn't only occur in the global north, but here, for example, in Colombia, we had a long history of slavery, and the African Colombian people play a really important role in the development of our country and of our cultural development. So what do you think is important for language teachers to introduce topics regarding historical and political context into the, for example, foreign language classes?
Yeah, I am a foreign language teacher. I teach English here in Brazil too. I always try to do this with my students, right? I think it is important for them to, even for them to understand why English is the most spoken language in the world right now, right? I think that history plays such an important role in our lives right now that they should understand this, right? For example, today I had a class with a student, and I was teaching them, members of the family, he's a basic student, and I was teaching them stepfather, stepmother, stepdaughter, and etc. And he asked me, oh, teacher, because here in Portuguese we have, do you know the tire of the car that stays in the back truck, which is the step tire? So here in Brazil, we call this step tire estepe, right? And then I didn't say anything, but he said to me, oh my God, this stepdaughter, stepfather, stepsister, is this related to the step tire of the car? Right? That we say here in Brazil is stepe. And I said, yes, it is. And he said, but how? Why? And then I had to explain a little bit of history to him, you know, and the etymology of the word, and how this word was born, and how we as Brazilians, because of the United States imperialism, how we imported this word into our language, and the word is now in a dictionary. It's estepe here in Brazil. We use this in our Portuguese dictionary. So it is really important, especially for us here in Latin America, concerning American imperialism, for example, for them to understand that why are we studying English, for example? So we have to go back to history in order to explain to them this, right? So I don't escape from history in my English classes. Actually, I put a lot of history, right? And I think that the more we teach them about this in our foreign languages classes, right? We teach them that they are not just learning language, they have to learn the culture also, and the historical process of that language in order to become a better speaker, a competent speaker, a proficient speaker, right? So the desire of most people who wants to dominate a foreign language is this: I want to become a proficient speaker, right? So if you want, you need to know these things, right? Or it's desirable, at least, I think, in my modest opinion, right?
Okay, thank you, teacher, professor.
Thank you so much. No problem, it's okay. Guys, I really need to go. I have another class now.
The last.
I did.
Professor, just 2 minutes. I would like to make a final question before you go.
Okay. Okay.
Professor, it is very interesting because while you were talking, I was thinking about this issue of post-coloniality and post-colonialism. So you are saying that through the study of literature, we could also foster, for example, a more like politically aware like situation, like a stance towards language teaching, and also like a lingua franca perspective, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So I'd like to bring especially the decoloniality into this work. Why? Because we have a tendency to put in our works, especially academic works, right, only epistemology that comes from Europe. Like, you can do it, like there is no problem, but we also have good production of epistemology here in Latin America, and the coloniality, for example, is a thing that illustrates that brilliantly, right? And for me, also, it is very difficult to analyze a Brazilian work with the European lenses, you know, because although they have produced great works, and this is undeniable, I need to get theorists from here, from Latin America, people that have a voice here that understands our problems, our demands, to analyze a Brazilian book, you know. So yes, I'm not saying that we should refuse and deny the European knowledge. No, not at all. We should incorporate this in our work, but also we have great voices here in Latin America that are producing great content, and we should use them to analyze our things, right? So I really believe in the knowledge that we are producing here in Latin America. Really, it is very important, and we should give more attention to this, because we have great people working here, right? And we should valorize this more. Sorry, the connection is failing. I can't listen.
Yo creo que sin los audífonos, Aidilla.
John, ¿tú me puedes escuchar?
Sí, ya, listo.
¿Ya fue? Okay, Professor Marina, thank you very much for being here with us today.
Okay.
And I would like to see you in the next, in our next research.
Okay. I thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure for me to be here. I thank you for the opportunity to present this research.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was really fun, and it was an excellent talk. Thanks a lot. We appreciate your company here today.
Okay, thank you, guys. It was awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I will stop the recording right now.
Okay.